Picture a map of Europe. You're looking at it the way a military planner would. Not as a tourist, not as a traveler. You're looking at borders, terrain, and threat vectors. You're looking at who's nervous and who isn't. Right now, nearly every European leader who speaks publicly about defense sounds like someone who just checked their smoke detector and realized it hasn't had a battery in 10 years. The Swedish defense chief told citizens the country needs to prepare for war. Britain's defense secretary called this a pre-war era. A former head of Poland's National Security Bureau said NATO has, at most, 3 years to get ready before a potential confrontation with Russia. 3 years, and yet there is one country on that map that is completely calm, a country whose generals don't sound alarmed when they speak, whose politicians don't scramble to announce emergency military budgets, a country whose leadership, when asked about the Russian threat, speaks with the quiet confidence of someone who already has their house in order. That country shares a 1,340-kilometer border with Russia, the longest land border with Russia of any EU member state. That country was invaded by the Soviet Union in 1939. That country has lived in the shadow of Russian military power for its entire modern existence, and that country is Finland. Finland, a nation of just 5.5 million people, slightly bigger than the state of Minnesota, has, by almost every serious metric, the most capable, combat-ready conventional military in Europe today, if we set aside Ukraine, which is fighting its own existential war as we speak. Not France, not Germany, not the UK, Finland. And the reason almost nobody talks about it isn't because Finland is hiding it. It's because Finland has been so consistently, methodically serious about defense for so long that it never needed to make a noise about it. Finland didn't need a wake-up call. Finland never fell asleep. So today, we're going to talk about how a country half the size of New York City's metropolitan population built a war machine that would make most NATO partners uncomfortable if they sat down and looked at the number. We're going to talk about the history that shaped this, the culture that sustains it, and the strategic lesson that the rest of Europe is only now starting to understand, decades late. To understand why Finland is the way it is today, you have to go back to a single winter, a winter that Finns have never forgotten, and probably never will. November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invades Finland. Stalin's plan was simple, almost embarrassingly simple. Finland was small, the Red Army was massive, the war would last about 2 weeks. Soviet commanders were reportedly so confident, they brought their dress uniforms to Helsinki, ready for the victory parade. It didn't go that way. What followed was one of the most stunning military upsets of the 20th century. The Finns, outnumbered roughly 3-to-1 in manpower and completely outgunned in tanks and aircraft, didn't break. They didn't run, they fought in temperatures that sometimes dropped below -40 degrees Celsius, with a ferocity and tactical creativity that stunned the world. Finnish ski troops moved silently through forests the Red Army couldn't navigate. Finnish snipers became legends. Improvised weapons, including the famous Molotov cocktail, a name the Finns invented with dark irony after Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov claimed the bombs being dropped on Helsinki were actually bread delivery, were used to destroy Soviet armor. At the Battle of Suomussalmi, a Finnish force of around 11,000 men destroyed an entire Soviet division of 47,000. Destroyed it. The bodies and burned out tanks were left in the snow. The Soviets eventually overwhelmed Finland through sheer mass and weight. Finland lost territory, a significant chunk of it, but Finland was never conquered, never occupied. The Soviets, who expected capitulation in 2 weeks, signed a peace treaty after 105 days because continuing the war was costing them more than they could afford politically. Finland paid an enormous price, but it survived, and that experience, that specific, traumatic, defining experience, became the DNA of Finnish defense policy forever after. The lesson was not, we were lucky. The lesson was, if you make the cost of attacking you high enough, even a vastly larger enemy will choose not to pay it. That lesson is still being taught in Finnish schools today. It shapes how Finnish politicians think. It shapes how ordinary Finnish citizens think about military service. It is, in ways both formal and invisible, the foundation of everything we're going to talk about for the rest of this video. Finland built its entire national security posture around one central idea. The enemy must always believe that invading Finland will cost more than it is worth. Let's talk about what Finland has actually built starting with the most fundamental question in any military analysis, the numbers. How many people can you actually put in the field? In peacetime, Finland's professional standing military is small, about 24,000 full-time soldiers. For a country its size, that's not remarkable. A lot of European countries have that, but here's where it gets interesting. In wartime, Finland can mobilize to a fighting strength of 280,000 soldiers within weeks, not months, weeks, because Finland maintains a system of universal conscription. Every Finnish man, and a growing number of women who volunteer, serves 6 to 12 months of military training. When they finish, they don't go home and forget about it. They are assigned to a specific unit, a specific role, a specific position, in a specific formation. They train for that role in regular reserve exercise. They know exactly where they go and what they do when the call comes. This isn't theoretical. These aren't soldiers on a spreadsheet. They are real people with real training, real assigned equipment stored in real warehouses, who would know exactly where to report within 72 hours of mobilization being declared. 280,000 soldiers in a country of 5.5 million people. That's roughly 5% of the entire population under arms in wartime, and that's just the first wave. Beyond the 280,000, Finland maintains a reserve pool of nearly 900,000 people, men and women, who have completed military training and can be called up to replace casualties and reinforce units over time. In a long, grinding conflict, that depth matters enormously. Think about what those numbers actually mean in comparison to larger countries. The United Kingdom has a population roughly 12 times larger than Finland. If the UK operated on the Finnish model, it would have 3.3 million soldiers in its wartime army and a reserve pool of over 10 million. The United States, scaled the same way, would have a wartime army of 16 million and reserves of nearly 55 million people. Those numbers sound like science fiction, because for the UK and the US, they are. Neither country could train, equip, or realistically field anything close to that. But for Finland, those numbers aren't fiction. They exist. They've been carefully built and maintained over decades. Compare that to most of Western Europe, which spent the 1990s and 2000s tearing down the very infrastructure that would make this kind of mobilization possible. Most European countries abolished conscription. Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, gone. They shifted to small, professional, highly trained expeditionary forces designed to go on overseas missions in places like Afghanistan and Mali. Nimble, modern, expensive, and completely incapable of fighting a large-scale conventional war on European soil. The entire strategic logic of European defense was quietly rewritten to assume that a major land war in Europe was impossible. Finland never rewrote that logic. Finland looked at the same post-Cold War world and said, Russia is still there. The threat never left, and so neither did we. But soldiers without equipment are just people standing in a field. So let's talk about what Finland's military actually has to fight with. And this is where things get genuinely remarkable. Finland has approximately 600 main battle tanks. 600? That makes it one of the most heavily armored militaries in Europe by absolute numbers, and almost certainly the most heavily armored on a per capita basis. For context, the UK, with 12 times the population, currently has fewer than 200 operational tanks in service. Finland has what military analysts consistently describe as the most powerful artillery force in Europe, outside of Russia itself and Ukraine. That means a lot of guns, a lot of rocket artillery systems, and critically, the ammunition to actually use them for an extended period of time. That last point is not trivial. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, one of the first things European nations discovered when they tried to help was that their ammunition stockpiles were almost completely empty. Countries that had technically functioning artillery pieces found they had days, sometimes just days, worth of ammunition to fire from them. Decades of assuming there would be no major war had led to a logical conclusion. Why store ammunition you'll never use? Finland never made that assumption. Finland has massive pre-positioned ammunition stocks, specifically calculated to sustain high-intensity combat for a prolonged period. Finland's top general stated publicly that Finnish forces could keep fighting considerably longer than most NATO partners before running out of what they need. Finland also has one of the largest and most capable air defense networks in Europe. It operates a fleet of F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, the most advanced tactical aircraft in the NATO inventory, having made one of the sharpest and most strategically significant procurement decisions of the last decade when it chose the F-35 over competing European offers. The breadth of equipment is also worth noting. Anti-ship missiles, coastal defense systems, sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities, a robust naval presence designed specifically for operations in the complex archipelago environment of the Baltic Sea, an environment that gives Finnish forces an enormous home field advantage that no invader can simply overcome with superior numbers. And behind all of this sits a supply chain of pre-stocked equipment, vehicles, weapons, ammunition, stored in hardened facilities spread across the country, assigned to specific reserve units, ready to be issued when those units are called up. This is not a military that would run out of anything on day 3. Now, you might be wondering how Finland, a country that has never been wealthy by European standards, a country that spent decades under significant budget pressure, managed to build and sustain all of this without bankrupting itself. The answer is a combination of ruthless strategic foresight and extraordinary timing. When the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, almost every NATO country did the same thing. They looked at their enormous military establishment, the warehouses full of tanks, the depots packed with artillery, the stockpiles of ammunition, and they decided this was all unnecessary weight they no longer had to carry. Defense budgets were slashed, equipment was mothballed or scrapped, the so-called peace dividend was spent. Warehouses full of still functional, still lethal military hardware were being offered at prices that would seem almost satirical in retrospect. Germany alone was disposing of massive amounts of equipment from the former East German military, which overnight found itself without a country to defend. Finland went shopping with cash in hand and a clear strategic assessment that the Russian threat hadn't actually gone anywhere, just temporarily retreated. Finland bought up equipment at pennies on the dollar. Tanks, artillery system, vehicles, all still functional, all still capable of delivering lethal effect, all purchased at a fraction of their original cost and integrated into Finnish stockpiles. Other European countries thought Finland was being quaint, holding on to an outdated 20th century concept of war when the future was obviously small, fast, professional forces doing precision operations in distant desert. Those countries are now spending billions trying to rebuild what they threw away. Finland never threw it away. But the smart spending doesn't stop there. The conscription system itself is, from a pure economic standpoint, extraordinarily cost efficient. Conscripts are paid a fraction of what professional soldiers earn. You don't carry a 30-year pension obligation for every person who serves 6 months. You don't pay year-round salaries for a force of 280,000 people. You pay a standing force of 24,000, and you call the rest when you need them. The result is a country that, for much of the period between 1990 and 2022, spent less than 2% of GDP on defense, the same target figure that NATO asks of its members, a target that most members consistently fail to meet, while maintaining a military capability that vastly exceeds almost every country that was technically complying with that same standard. Finland wasn't just strong, Finland was efficient, and in national defense, efficiency multiplied over decades is what allows a small country to punch so far above its weight that larger neighbors start to feel quietly unsettled. Here's the thing about military hardware. Tanks don't fight wars. Ammunition stockpiles don't win battles. People do. And the most important resource any military has is the one that can't be purchased at any price, stored in any warehouse, or manufactured in any factory. The genuine willingness of ordinary citizens to pick up a weapon and defend their country, knowing they might not come home. History is full of militaries that looked impressive on paper and collapsed the moment they faced real adversity. Afghanistan's national army, trained, equipped, and funded by the United States and NATO for 20 years, dissolved in days when the Taliban moved against it in 2021. Not because the soldiers lacked training, not because they lacked equipment, but because when the moment came, not enough of them believed deeply enough in what they were fighting for to accept the cost of fighting. Finland does not have that problem. Consistently, in poll after poll conducted over many years, Finland ranks at or near the very top of any survey measuring citizens' willingness to personally take up arms and defend their country in the event of war. The numbers are striking. Around 83% of Finns say they would be willing to fight for their country if it were attacked. For comparison, the UK, which has a proud military tradition and considers itself a serious defense nation, sits around 33% in similar survey. Germany is lower. Several other European nations are lower still, 83% versus 33%. That gap is not a rounding error. That is a fundamentally different relationship between a population and the concept of national defense, and it's not an accident. Finnish culture carries the memory of the Winter War not as a distant historical footnote, but as a living inheritance, the story of how Finland held, against a Red Army that everyone else assumed would roll over the country in days is not just a chapter in a history textbook. It's part of the national identity in a deep, almost cellular way. It informs how Finnish children are raised, what they're taught to be proud of, how they talk about their country. There's a Finnish word, sisu, that doesn't translate cleanly into any other language. It describes something like resilience, but more than that. It's the quality of continuing to act when rational calculation says you should stop. When the odds are impossible, when the cold is unbearable, when the enemy is at the gate, sisu is what keeps you going. That word survived the Winter War. It is still very much alive in how Finns think about themselves and their country. This matters for military effectiveness in ways that go beyond the philosophical. A citizen who genuinely believes in what they're defending is a more dangerous opponent. They take initiative, they improvise, they keep fighting when a soldier who's there only because they have to be would stop. In a long war, especially in a defensive war on familiar terrain, that quality is worth more than any number of tanks. Finland's military isn't just strong, it's motivated. And in war, motivation is often the last variable standing when everything else has been exhausted. Now we get to the piece of the Finnish model that is perhaps the most sophisticated and the least understood by outsiders. In Finland, the military doesn't exist in isolation from society. It isn't a separate institution that does its own thing behind closed doors while the rest of the country gets on with normal life. In Finland, the concept of defense extends far beyond the Ministry of Defense, far beyond the generals and the soldiers. It reaches into hospitals and telecommunications, into media organizations and energy providers, into municipal governments and private logistic companies, into the school. This approach is called total defense, and it's been a formal part of Finnish security doctrine for decades. The concept is built on a simple recognition. Modern warfare doesn't just target armies. As we've watched in Ukraine, where Russia has systematically attacked power grids, water systems, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure, war in the 21st century is fought against the entire fabric of a society, not just its military arm. Finland has spent decades thinking through exactly this problem and building systems to address it. There are extensive networks of bomb shelters. Bridges are pre-fitted with mounting points for explosive charges that can be detonated to slow an advancing enemy. Critical infrastructure has redundancy built into it so that losing one node doesn't collapse the system. But total defense isn't primarily about physical infrastructure. It's about people and institutions knowing in advance how to work together under pressure. Representatives from business, media, healthcare, energy, logistics, government, all the way down to municipal level, come together regularly to run exercises, not unlike military exercises, but designed to answer the question, if the worst happens, how does this society keep functioning? The goal isn't just to resist a military attack, it's to deny any potential adversary the ability to win by targeting civilians. If Russia, or any other actor, hope to break Finnish society by hitting power plants or flooding the media environment with disinformation or disrupting supply chains, they would find that Finland has already run that scenario multiple times. The procedures exist, the people know their roles. This approach has another effect that is harder to quantify, but no less real. When a society prepares collectively for a serious threat, it changes how people relate to national defense. It stops being something that other people do, something that happens in barracks far from daily life. It becomes a shared responsibility. Everyone has a role. Everyone is part of it. That might sound abstract, but it's the reason that 83% figure exists. It's not that Finns are born braver than other people. It's that the Finnish system has, deliberately and consistently, kept national defense connected to ordinary civilian life in a way that most European countries severed 30 years ago. Finland's NATO membership, which came in April 2023 after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, forced a historic reversal of Finland's long-standing policy of military non-alignment. Didn't just add a country to the alliance. It added arguably the most prepared conventional fighting force in the organization. NATO gained 1,340 kilometers of hardened border, an army that can mobilize 280,000 soldiers in weeks, Europe's most capable artillery, a population with an 83% willingness to fight, and a doctrine of total defense that every other NATO member is now scrambling to understand and replicate. Europe is finally having a conversation it probably should have had 10 years ago about conscription, about reserve forces, about ammunition stockpiles, about the willingness of societies to defend themselves. But most of that conversation is starting from zero. Countries that abolished conscription are now discussing bringing it back. Countries that sold off their ammunition stockpiles are now spending billions to refill them. Countries that downsized their armies to small professional forces are now questioning whether that model can deter Russia. Finland never had to have any of those conversations because Finland never made those choices. Now, the Finnish model isn't perfectly replicable everywhere. Conscription works in Finland partly because the willingness to defend the country is already so high. If you tried to introduce mandatory military service into a society where only a third of people say they'd be willing to fight, the result would be very different. You'd get resentful, unmotivated conscripts, and that's not a military asset. But there are elements of the Finnish approach that any country can learn from. The integration of civilian society into defense planning, the culture of resilience, the maintenance of reserve systems, the willingness to keep investing in capabilities that might seem outdated or unnecessary in peacetime, the long-term procurement planning that allows a country to buy smart, buy early, and buy enough. Above all, the willingness to keep asking the uncomfortable question, if something went wrong tomorrow, are we ready? Finland has been asking that question every single year since 1940. The answer today is yes. There's a dark joke that circulates in Finnish military circles. It goes something like this. Russian soldiers, when they cross into Finnish territory, will find that the snow starts shooting back. It's a joke, but like all good jokes, it contains something true inside it. Finland is small. Finland is cold. Finland is quiet on the world stage. It doesn't have aircraft carriers. It doesn't project power halfway around the world. Its defense minister doesn't give speeches at Davos about global security architecture. But Finland does have something that none of its more prominent, more loudly confident neighbors can claim: the genuine, tested, verifiable ability to make any invasion astronomically expensive, not just in tanks and aircraft, in time, in blood, in political costs, in the grinding, months-long attrition of fighting a motivated population in terrain they know and love, with equipment they've had decades to prepare, led by officers who have spent their entire careers training for exactly this scenario. Russia has invaded Finland before. It cost them more than they expected, far more. And Finland, which has spent the 85 years since then doing nothing but quietly, methodically, efficiently getting stronger, would cost them more again. That's the deterrent. Not a threat, not a speech, not a press release, just the cold, measurable, undeniable fact that attacking Finland would be extraordinarily painful. And in a world where Europe is finally waking up to the reality that military deterrence matter, that peace is not self-sustaining, that the post-Cold War holiday from history is over, maybe the most important thing Europe can do is look north. Look at a country that never went on holiday. Look at Finland.